Hello and welcome to the CX Files for January 30th, 2025. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan. Mark, today I'm actually coming to you from Alexandria in Egypt, where I've been spending a lot of time with clients, with old friends, with a country that I've not visited in quite a period. And it's nice to reconnect. Egypt is always an amazing place to check out, both from a business as well as a leisure standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been seeing so much stuff going on in Egypt recently. I mean, it's one of the fastest developing multilingual locations in the whole of Africa and the sort of EMEA region. So it's definitely very interesting. And I don't know, I mean, how long ago it is since you visited, but for me, it's like I think more than a decade now. You know, back in the days before the revolution.
Yeah, exactly. For me, the last time I was here was in 2010, literally before what happened in the early part of 2011. And definitely the country remains dynamic. The country remains very focused on its vision outward to the rest of the world. And I think that's what served it so well. And I will say this, Mark, I remember in the days, the heady days, the early days of Egyptian outsourcing, there was just this desire to succeed. And, here we are 20 years or so after my first visit, and the country remains, in my opinion, one of the classiest and one of the most value-add destinations for any type of business or IT service that you can find.
Okay, excellent. Well, let's jump forward then to our interview for this week. And I know that we're heading off to Switzerland, aren't we?
We are heading off to Switzerland, and we're heading off to have a chat with Greg Uglioni. Now, Greg is a really interesting guy. He has a tremendous pedigree and background in our space. The reason I caught up with Greg is because he is probably one of the most interesting people I've had a chance to chat with, and also to listen to, because he's the host of a podcast like you and I. He's a podcaster, and he runs a discussion online called CX Goalkeeper. Now, Greg's always posting provocative points on LinkedIn about what's happening in the industry. He's always discussing elements that I think are maybe some of the harder ones to take on, the ones that people in the CX industry maybe like to sweep under the carpet. But he asks the hard questions. And that's something I said to him in the course of our discussion. I like the fact that he does ask hard questions and he's not afraid to express his opinion. So we talked a little bit about what it means to drive human-centric CX. We talked a little bit about what Greg's views were about where customer experience was going. There's a point during the course of our discussion with Greg where he talks a little bit about the 5 pillars of human-centric transformation. And as we go through the discussion, as we go through the chat, one of the things that I really think that the listeners will appreciate is how engaged Greg is with all these different elements around the operations of CX, around the philosophy of the human-centric CX delivery. And it's really a warmth and a passion that shines through.
That's great. I mean, I did listen to the interview preparing for this discussion with you, and one of the things I took away from it was, Greg seemed to take some convincing to start his podcast. It was almost as if he felt that these discussions are already taking place anyway. But I think that nowadays to have people that have got the kind of insight that he clearly has, it's really valuable because there's a lot of noise in places like LinkedIn these days. So finding whether somebody's writing a book or doing a podcast or creating a newsletter, however you're doing it, if you can focus attention on these kind of deep CX discussions in some way that goes beyond just a lot of the froth that we're seeing on social media, then I think that's really valuable.
I agree. And I would recommend that we head over to hear what Greg Uglioni had to say, coming to us straight from Zurich. And I hope everybody appreciates listening to this podcast as I did conducting the interview. Now, the CX Files is joined today by Greg Uglioni, who is a recent friend, but certainly somebody that I have been following for quite some time on LinkedIn. Greg has got some of the more provocative posts and, quite frankly, some of the more constructive posts that I see as it relates to our industry. And that prompted me to reach out to Greg to see if we would have the pleasure of having him join us on an episode of the CX Files. And very fortunately for myself and for the entire listening audience, he was more than happy to get together and have a chat. So, Greg, you join us today from beautiful Zurich in Switzerland. Welcome to the podcast.
Peter, thank you very much for this opportunity. And I say thank you very much and really appreciate what you're doing for the community. And in particular, all this discussion that you are having with great people. It helps us, it helps the community. Thank you very much for that.
Well, no, I truly appreciate those kind words, and it's me who thanks you for joining us today. Because as we're recording it, I believe it's late in your evening on a Friday. So certainly the sacrifice you're making from the weekend is definitely very much appreciated, Greg. You know, from the standpoint of what you do, let me just state my reflective gratitude in terms of your efforts and what CX Goalkeeper does. Would you talk a little bit as we start about CX Goalkeeper and exactly what the organization, what the objective of the organization is, and what you bring to the table?
Sure, thank you very much. I try to keep the story short and let's deep dive later. Um, Shortly or during pandemic, I started having questioning myself what I'm doing in the evening. And it was, shall I watch television, movies, and so on, or what I can do? And then I start chatting with other CX people, and one guy told me in a very nice way, but what we are discussing could be interesting for others. And then I said, okay, but what shall I do? And he said, yeah, you should start podcasting. I said, but it's not my mother tongue. It's complex. How should it work? And so on. But I said, let's try. And then I spoke with a very senior lady that was really helping me also in other things like a coach. And she said, I think it could really be helpful for you to get out of your comfort zone and try something new. And therefore I started, and basically the CX Goalkeeper was born. CX is one of my passions. I think therefore I'm on this podcast. And the other one is soccer or football for our European friends. And I put my two passions together. And sometimes I use football or soccer examples to explain what we can do, what we should do better, and why, for example, it's so important to focus on winning the match. One goal, let's win the match all together.
I love the allusion to sports, and the nice thing about football is the fact that it is the universal sport. I don't think there's a country in the world where people are not treating it like a religion practically. I'll say even in Canada, where we've been relatively late to the game, no pun intended, the the soccer matches, the professional soccer teams are getting more and more fans, are getting more and more interest, and the matches are actually getting sold out, which is a lot of fun. We're very lucky. We've got Montreal FC where I live. I'm not going to comment on their track record, but you know, at the same time, it's great to get out and see them. And if they're able to beat Toronto FC, then all the better. So, Greg, let's talk a little bit about what some of the elements in the industry right now that are making people talk and quite frankly making people really I think take sides on different issues. And when you and I caught up a few days ago, one of the things that we discussed that I thought was really interesting and I thought would be a nice starting point today is the idea around or the concepts around human-centric solutions in the contact center. And as a starting point, what does human-centric or what do human-centric solutions mean to you? Because I think there's a lot of people who have different views. And I think if you asked 100 CX professionals what human-centric solutions meant to them, you probably get 100 different answers. Let's use that as a point of departure from the standpoint of our chat today.
Thank you. And I think you start with a very simple questions and therefore let's kick off. No, let's really deep dive. You shared this question with me in advance, and I was really thinking, how can I best position this topic in really few seconds? Because at the end we have few seconds to answer to these questions. And I think about 3 words, and I can comment on them. Or 4. The first one is transactions. Is a contact with the customer only a transaction, or is it an interactions where you can start interacting and having both on the same level, or do we want to achieve relationship? It's not a transaction, it's not an interaction, but it's a relationship, building something with the customer together to the customer, and perhaps also progressing even more. But let's keep on these 3 topics. I think for me, human centricity is stopping in a contact center, thinking about this context that we have with customer, about transactions or interaction, and starting building a relationship. But I don't want to preach only about building a relationship. For some interactions, it's important to have only one interactions. Self-servicing. I need to know where my box is standing, where my order is. That's something you don't need to build a relationship. There it's an interactions. Put this information as quick as possible and think about which value you can create for the customer. And basically there we speak always about creating value for the company, creating value for the customer means an important interaction.
One of the things that I think a lot of enterprises right now are taking into account is the partners that they're looking to try and include from the perspective of how they deliver CX, Greg. Based around what you've talked about and what you've studied when it comes to the whole concept about human-centric solutions, what should an enterprise contact center or customer experience leader be looking for when they're going out to try and find a partner that might bring some of these elements to the table, in your opinion?
I think there it's extremely important to understand what you want to achieve. What's your target? Which problem do you want to solve if you're looking for partners? And then based on your needs and the needs of the customer that you are serving, trying to find the best possible partner with the boundaries that are always defined in business and working throughout it.
That's really good feedback. And I think that the conciseness of what you're saying, sometimes there doesn't need to be lots of different steps. Sometimes there doesn't need to be all sorts of different elements. Sometimes it's just common sense and just realizing, understanding what you need, where the challenges are, and then figuring out how you can find partners that have got the subject matter expertise, that have got the background in particular areas that, as you say, allows you to solve for that. Now, something else, Greg, that when we caught up a few days ago, we talked about were what you referred to as the 5 pillars of human-centric transformation in the context of customer experience. And I thought that would be an amazing topic to go down the rabbit hole, so to speak. So why don't you take us through what these 5 pillars are and maybe chat a lot about each one's unique elements, but also about the interrelation between these 5.
Great. It means you have now at least 1 hour time to discuss about that.
Well, that might mean a few different podcasts, but let's take the Cook's tour of the Cliff Notes.
Sure. And I think I try to extremely simplify existing frameworks. Why I did that is because I wanted to involve the management in this human-centric transformation from the beginning. And if they're asking you what you're doing, you cannot explain them 1 hour long what you're doing with strange words and so on. And therefore, I extremely simplified different frameworks, and I know that your audience will say, oh, but these are the 5 pillars, or very similar to the 5 pillars of this from the CXPA, the Customer Experience Professional Associations. Yes, they are very similar. I try to pick out the most important thing and to leverage on them. The first one is you need to have a strategy. And it's not only in this human-centric transformation that you need to have the strategy, but you need to follow the strategy of the company you are working for. Where you are delivering this strategy, it means what you are doing needs to be fit together with the targets of the company, what they want to achieve, with their vision, with their goals. And then when you are aligned and you try to solve the problem, back to what we discussed earlier, to solve a problem of the company, then you can start defining, okay, I have strategy, let's kick off. And then at least you have an idea, you have a vision, what you want to achieve, what you can achieve. And then from my point of view, back to your first question, you need to understand people. You need to understand the human beings involved. Often people or other people forget that there are employees and customers. And I think every time employees and customers are involved, and therefore we need to understand both. I was working in an hospital, and for me was an incredible opportunity to follow nurses and physicians and to see and to feel how they were working, how they were interacting with the patients, and what was important for them. Not was important for me, but was important for these employees, and what is important for the customers. This is the second pillar, understanding people. The third one is when you understand people and you understand where are the problems, you need to try to solve them. And then you comes to this change, to this transformation, applying innovative way of transformation. Perhaps for a lot of your audience, they are well known, leveraging design thinking, leveraging human-centered design, but in a lot of industries and in a lot of companies is not known. You go into a committee and the most paid guy says you need to do this and that to solve this problem, and then you start implementing. And what we said is, no, we want to change that. We want to build that from the bottom, involving employees and patients from the beginning, not from the beginning of the testing phase when the product or the functionality was already there, but really from the beginning, creating and innovating. This is the third one. Going to the fourth one, I think it's extremely important, and a lot of people forget that, is measuring the progress of the transformation. Today, I am here, tomorrow I want to be there. Let's measure that. And the target should always be to be a bit better than yesterday. And the last one, from my point of view, the most important one, is culture. Culture within a company, culture within the team. Having this opportunity to empower employees to say what are the problems, to share them, to think about solution, giving them some freedom to find a solution, way to solve problems, and then going back. These are the 5 pillars. Happy to deep dive if you have interest. Strategy, understanding people, the change, the innovation, the real transformation, measuring, and the culture.
I'm going to get into measuring in a second, Greg, because that's something I really want to pick up, perhaps more in a bit of a deep dive. But you did mention number 5 there that really piqued my interest, and that was culture. Now, one of the things, as listeners to the podcast know, culture was very much, I think, a watchword of 2024. And I kept hearing organization heads, I kept hearing heads of contact centers speaking of the extent to which they were looking to try and foster a warm culture within their working environment, or that when they were sourcing an outsourcing partner, that culture was very much at the root of one of the selection criteria that they would be considering. Can you tell me the extent to which organizations have maybe identified culture as something that they need to focus on, but how many of them do you think are really following through on this?
It's really a good question, and I think it depends from the business, from the industry. What we decided when we started this transformation in the hospital, we started focusing on the culture from the beginning. From day one, we really focused on that. And please let me give 2 examples. I think perhaps somebody also from the audience could leverage on that. When I was working in a contact center, we had a mannequin we put on the mannequin clothes, and he was Juan. Juan was one of our customer. And then he went through all the different teams, all the different departments. And when we were discussing about changing something, or when we were discussing, trying to find solution, we asked, which value are we creating for Juan? What is important for him? And it was really extremely supportive to see Juan there, because he was there with us, and we were able to discuss. And a similar solution, and perhaps your audience will laugh now, we had in the hospital. Physicians are a bit different, and then we didn't have a mannequin, but we had a skeleton. And the skeleton was one person. We employed Helge. Sorry, that's a German name. And Helge has one rule in our department. He's always guilty. Why we started with that? Speaking about culture, often meeting starts, there is a problem, we need to find a solution. And instead of focusing to find the solution from the beginning, people focus on who is guilty, you didn't do this, he was guilty, it's not good, and so on. And we say, no, let's stop this discussion. We don't need to find out who is guilty, because we know we hired Helge. Helge is guilty. He's one employer of us. And by the way, he was already twice employee of the month in the last month, and is guilty. Now let's focus on how we can find a solution. And these are few measures that everybody can implement at zero cost that help transform the culture within a team, within a department, or within a company.
Let's circle back to the fourth element that you discussed in terms of the 5 pillars, Greg, and that is measurement and measuring success. Now, if I gave you $1, or in your case, a Swiss franc, for every time I saw a poll on LinkedIn the last little while about what's the best measurement, what's the best KPI that you should be using in terms of measuring success in a CX environment, well, you'd be a very rich person right now, especially considering how the Swiss franc is comparing to the Canadian dollar right now. I'd be very poor. But I wanted to get a sense from you about the prioritization of different measures, about different units of measurement or different types of measurements that CX leaders should be thinking about as we kick the new year off. What do you think are the best ways of measuring success going forward? And do you have any sense about what you would counsel an organization or somebody responsible for identifying how well something is doing or how well an organization is going, and what they need to be focusing on as they look towards the next 12 months?
Sure. And there, I hope that your audience will not leave this discussion, because I'm going to say something that not everybody will like. I think that this is extremely important also in our job. I spoke about the pillar strategy. Strategy is linked to targets. The company has targets. And if you have targets, you need to measure these targets. And you need to link what you are doing, what every CX person, experts, specialist is doing. It should tie this what they are doing to the targets of the company. For me, it's not about discussing the ROI of CX. ROI is not a project. You calculate the ROI of something that finishes at some point in time, because it's the return on the investment. I think we should stop discussing about that. We need to link everything what we are doing to relevant business KPI. And at the end is the P&L of a company, profit and loss. I know it gets split in a lot of different KPIs, but link everything to that. It doesn't make sense to message our egos or the ego of our boss with the NPS and saying our NPS increased by, I don't know, 2 points, 3 points, and so on. Perhaps internally it's still okay in the team, but let's link this increase of customer satisfaction, increased customer loyalty to how much more sale have we done, or how many cross and upsell were we able to do in our contact center, how many product change were we able to do that increase the profit of the revenues of the company. And if you start calculating really what it matters to the business, and these are increasing revenues and decreasing cost, then you will be really successful. I hope that everybody starts doing that from now or in 2025, and I think we will have a successful year.
Well, we can keep our fingers crossed. Greg, last question. For anybody who wants to find out more about CX Goalkeeper, how do they find you? How do they find the podcast? How do they find your organization?
Thank you. cxgoalkeeper.com is the easiest way to find me. I am very active on LinkedIn, therefore you can find me also on LinkedIn. I am sure we will share all these links also in the show notes.
We sure will. And for those, well, pretty well for everybody, because this is an audio podcast, but for those who are listening right now, I was going to say who aren't able to see, but for those listening, Greg has got an amazing ball cap, a CX Goalkeeper ball cap, and I don't know, are they for sale or not, or is that just something that people get complimentary?
You know, I got few requests in the last months, and I could start selling them. If really something wanted to have it, happy to share that. No problem at all.
Sounds great. Well, Greg, thank you very much for taking some time to chat today. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thanks for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much to you. It's always great, and thank you for what you're doing for the community. This podcast is amazing.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.
This podcast is amazing. This podcast is amazing. This podcast is amazing.